Jake Morrison wiped his sweaty palms on his pants as he walked through the massive doors of the examination hall. The 19-year-old human had never seen anything like this place before. The ceiling stretched up so high that he could barely see. The top and the walls were made of some kind of shimmering blue material that seemed to glow from within. Hundreds of desks filled the enormous room, each one occupied by a different alien species. Jake had been on Zarian Prime for 3 months now as an exchange student, but he still felt amazed every time he saw so many different creatures in one place. There were tall, thin beings with purple skin and 4 arms. Others looked like walking. Trees with silver bark and leaves that sparkled like diamonds. Some had tentacles instead of legs, sliding across the floor with wet, slippery sounds. The Galactic University of Advanced Sciences was famous throughout the galaxy for being the best school anywhere. Students came from thousands of different worlds to study here, but getting in was not easy. First, you had to pass the Universal Mathematical Reasoning Assessment. Most people just called it the math exam. Jake had heard stories about this test. That made his stomach feel sick. He found his assigned seat, number 847, and sat down carefully. The chair was made for beings much larger than humans, so his feet barely touched the floor. To his left sat a creature that looked like a giant insect, with bright green eyes and clicking mandibles. It was muttering something in a language that sounded like breaking glass. To his right was a being made entirely of what appeared to be living rock, with small crystals growing out of its shoulders. Jake looked around the room and tried to count how many different species he could see. There were the Voltarians who, everyone said, were the smartest beings in the galaxy. They had large, bulbous heads and tiny bodies with skin that changed colors based on their emotions. Right now, most of them were showing a deep purple color, which Jake had learned meant they were nervous, near the front of the room. A group of cephaloids were wrapped around their desks with their many tentacles. These creatures were known for their incredible ability to do math in their heads. They could solve problems that would take human computers hours to figure out. But even they looked worried today. The draconian students were easier to spot because of their size. These lizard-like beings stood nearly 8 feet tall and had scales that glittered like metal. They were usually very confident, but today Jake noticed that many of them were making low growling sounds, which he knew meant they were stressed. As Jake waited for the exam to begin, he remembered his conversation with Lucy Chun, another human exchange student from the night before. She had been studying for weeks, reading every book she could find about advanced mathematics. Lucy was much smarter than Jake when it came to numbers and equations. She had been the top student in her math classes back on Earth. "Jake, I'm so scared," she had told him over dinner in the cafeteria. "I've been reading about this exam, and it's supposed to be impossible. The pass rate is less than 2%. 2%? That means out of every 100 students who take it, only 2 will pass." Jake had tried to make her feel better, but honestly, he was just as scared as she was. Math had never been his best subject in school. He was more interested in history and literature. The only reason he was even at this university was because his school back on Earth had chosen him randomly for the exchange program. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hall, and all conversation stopped immediately. Professor Zixthara entered the room, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. He had seen the professor before, but it was still shocking every time. Professor Zixthara was a crystalline being, which meant her body was made entirely of living crystal. She stood 12 feet tall and had multiple faces, each one a different geometric shape. As she walked, her body caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the walls and ceiling. When she spoke, her voice came from all of her faces at once, creating a strange harmony that made Jake's ears tingle. "Students of the galaxy," Professor Zixthara began, her voice filling every corner of the massive room. "Today you will face the Universal Mathematical Reasoning Assessment. This examination has been given for over 3,000 years. It has been taken by the greatest minds from every corner of known space." Jake noticed how quiet the room had become. Even the creatures who had been making nervous sounds were now completely silent. The only noise was the soft humming of the room's air circulation system. The rules are simple, the professor continued. You have 4 standard galactic hours to complete the assessment. You may not communicate with other students in any way. You may not use any external calculation devices. You must rely only on your mind and the basic writing instruments provided. She gestured with one of her many arms, and small writing devices appeared at each desk. Jake picked up his and found that it was warm to the touch and seemed to know exactly what he wanted to write before he even thought about it. I must warn you, Professor Zixtara said, and now her voice took on a serious tone that made Jake's skin crawl. This examination is designed to challenge the very limits of mathematical reasoning. It has broken the spirits of countless brilliant minds. Many of you will not finish. Many of you will leave this room today knowing that your dreams of studying at this university are over. Around the room, Jake could see students beginning to panic. A mantoid scholar near the front was clicking its mandibles so rapidly that it sounded like a machine gun. Several of the geologian students were making deep rumbling sounds that Jake felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears. However, the professor continued, those few who do succeed will join the ranks of the galaxy's greatest thinkers. They will study alongside beings who have unlocked the secrets of the universe itself. She paused and looked around the room, her multiple faces seeming to make eye contact with every student at once. Are there any questions before we begin? The silence was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. No one moved. No one spoke. The tension in the room was so thick that it felt hard to breathe. Very well, Professor Zixtara said. Let the examination begin. She raised one of her crystal arms, and suddenly holographic displays appeared in front of every student. Jake blinked in surprise as his exam materialized in the air above his desk, glowing with a soft blue light. Immediately, the room erupted into chaos. Not loud chaos, but the kind of quiet panic that was somehow worse. Jake could hear the rapid breathing of dozens of different species. The Voltarian student's skin was now flashing between purple and red so quickly that it was making Jake dizzy. To look at them, the cephaloid students had gone completely still, which Jake knew meant they were thinking as hard as they possibly could. The draconian students were now making a low whining sound that Jake had never heard before. Lucy Chun, sitting about 20 rows ahead of him, had already grabbed her writing device and was frantically scribbling notes on a piece of paper that had appeared next to her holographic display. Even from this distance, Jake could see that her hands were shaking. Jake looked down at his own exam and felt a wave of confusion wash over him. This was not what he had expected at all. Instead of the complex equations and formulas he had been dreading, he saw something that looked almost familiar. It was a grid 9 squares by 9 squares with some numbers already filled in, but he pushed that thought away. This was supposed to be the hardest math test in the galaxy. There was no way it could be anything simple. He must be missing something important. Around him, the greatest mathematical minds in the known universe were already deep in concentration, working on problems that were clearly beyond his understanding. Jake took a deep breath and began to read the instructions more carefully, determined to at least try his best, even if he was doomed to fail like so many others before him. Jake stared at the glowing holographic display floating above his desk and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The examination paper showed a large square grid divided into smaller sections. Some of the squares had numbers in them, while others were empty. At the top of the display, instructions were written in the flowing script of the Universal Galactic language. He had been studying this language for months, but reading it still took him time. Slowly he worked through the instructions. The test was called a Universal Mathematical Reasoning Matrix. The rules talked about non-repetitive symbolic placement within designated dimensional quadrants and maintaining harmonic numerical balance across interdimensional calculation planes. Jake rubbed his forehead. The words sounded incredibly complicated, but when he looked at the actual grid, something felt strange. It reminded him of something he had seen before, though he could not quite remember what. Around him, the examination hall had turned into a scene of barely controlled panic. The sounds coming from hundreds of different alien species created a Symphony of academic terror. The Voltarian students, who everyone said were the smartest beings in the galaxy, were now flashing bright red, which Jake knew meant they were in extreme distress. To his left, the giant insect creature was clicking, its mandibles so fast that sparks were literally flying from its mouth. The sound was like someone rapidly clicking a pen, but much louder and more frantic. The creature's bright green eyes were darting back and forth across its holographic display, and Jake could see drops of some kind of alien sweat falling onto its desk. The rock-like being to his right was making deep grinding sounds like two boulders being rubbed together. Small pieces of crystal were actually breaking off from its shoulders and falling to the floor with tiny tinkling sounds. Jake had never seen a geologian in distress before, but this one was clearly having some kind of breakdown near the front of the room. The group of mantoid scholars that Jake had noticed earlier were in complete chaos. These creatures were supposed to be natural mathematicians able to solve complex problems faster than most computers. But right now they were all clicking and chattering at once, their multiple arms waving in the air as they tried to work on their exams. One of the mantoids suddenly stood up and started walking toward the exit. Professor Zixthara's multiple crystal faces turned to watch as the creature left the room, its head hanging low in defeat. Jake felt sorry for it. The examination had only been going on for 15 minutes, and students were already giving up. The cephaloid students were perhaps the most disturbing to watch. These tentacled beings were known for being able to think about many different problems at the same time. But now their tentacles were writhing and twisting in patterns that looked almost painful. One of them had wrapped all of its tentacles around its head and was rocking back and forth in its chair. The draconian students, who were usually so proud and confident, were making sounds that Jake had never heard before. It was like a cross between a growl and a whimper, and it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Several of them were actually crying, which was shocking to see from creatures that were nearly 8 feet tall and covered in metal-like scales. But perhaps the most disturbing sight was watching his fellow human students. Lucy Chun was frantically writing notes on every piece of paper she could find. Jake could see her from across the room, and even at this distance he could tell she was panicking. Her usually neat handwriting had become wild scribbles as she tried to work out complex mathematical formulas. Marcus Thompson, another human exchange student, was sitting about 10 rows behind Jake. Marcus had always been good at math back on Earth. He had won several mathematics competitions in high school and had been excited about taking this exam. But now Jake could see him pulling at his hair and staring at his holographic display with a look of complete confusion. Near the middle of the room, a group of cerebroid students were working together, which was allowed since they were actually a collective intelligence. But even with their combined brain power, they seemed to be struggling. Their usually silver skin was now dull and gray, and Jake could see small wisps of smoke coming from their heads, which meant they were thinking so hard that their brains were literally overheating. The quantum beings, who could supposedly think in multiple dimensions at once, were flickering in and out of visibility as they tried to solve their exams. This was a sign of extreme mental stress for their species. One of them flickered so rapidly that it looked like a strobe light, and Professor Zixthara had to walk over and tell it to calm down before it made other students sick. Jake looked back at his own exam and tried to focus. The grid was 9 squares wide and 9 squares tall. Some of the squares already had numbers in them, ranging from 1 to 9. The empty squares were waiting to be filled in. The instructions talked about making sure that certain rules were followed, but the language was so complex that Jake was having trouble understanding exactly what those rules were. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of trying to understand the complicated instructions, he looked at the pattern of numbers that were already in the grid. In the top left corner there was a smaller square that contained the numbers 1, 2, and 3 in some of the spaces. The top middle section had 4, 5, and 6 in some places. The pattern seemed almost familiar. As Jake studied the grid more carefully, he started to notice something interesting. It looked like each row was supposed to have different numbers in it, and each column seemed to follow the same rule. And the smaller sections within the bigger grid also seemed to follow some kind of pattern, but this could not be right. This was supposed to be the hardest mathematical examination in the galaxy. Brilliant minds from thousands of worlds had failed this test. There was no way it could be something simple. Around him, the sounds of academic despair were getting louder. A crystalloid student near the back of the room had actually shattered one of its limbs from stress. Medical drones were flying around the room, checking on students who were showing signs of mental exhaustion. Jake watched as another student got up and left. This time it was one of the Voltarians, and Jake could see tears streaming down its large, bulbous head. The creature's skin was now a color that Jake had never seen before, a kind of deep black that seemed to absorb light. More students began to leave. First one, then two, then a steady stream of defeated beings heading for the exit. The examination had been going on for less than an hour, and already dozens of students had given up. The sounds in the room were becoming quieter, but not because students were concentrating. It was because so many of them were leaving. Professor Zixthara stood at the front of the room, her multiple crystal faces showing what Jake thought might be sadness. She had probably seen this same scene thousands of times over the years. Brilliant students coming to take this exam full of hope and confidence, only to leave broken and defeated. Jake felt a wave of sympathy for all the students around him. These were supposed to be some of the smartest beings in the galaxy, and they were all struggling with something that he was starting to suspect might not be as complicated as everyone thought. He looked back at his grid and decided to try something simple. What if he just tried to fill in the empty squares with numbers that seemed to make sense? What if he ignored all the complicated language in the instructions and just followed the patterns he thought he could see? It was probably a stupid idea, but at this point Jake figured he had nothing to lose. He was going to fail anyway, so he might as well try something different than what everyone else was doing. Jake decided to ignore the complicated instructions and focus on the grid itself. He tilted his head to the side and looked at it from a different angle. The numbers 1 through 9 were scattered across the squares in what seemed like a random pattern. But Jake was starting to see something that made his heart beat faster. He counted the rows. 9 rows going across. He counted the columns. 9 columns going up and down. Then he looked at the smaller squares within the big grid. There were 9 of those too, each one containing 9 smaller squares inside it. Jake's mouth went dry, as a memory from his childhood suddenly came flooding back. He was 12 years old, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table on a Sunday morning. She was drinking her coffee and working on something in the newspaper while bacon cooked on the stove. He had asked her what she was doing. "It's called Sudoku." "Sweetie," she had said, showing him the page. "It's a number puzzle. You have to put the numbers 1 through 9 in each row, each column, in each of these little boxes. But you can only use each number once in each section." Jake stared at his holographic examination display and felt his hands start to shake. The universal mathematical reasoning matrix looked exactly like the puzzles his grandmother used to solve every morning with her breakfast. The same 9 by 9 grid, the same smaller 3 by 3 boxes, the same numbers from 1 to 9. He looked around the examination hall at the chaos surrounding him. Hundreds of the galaxy's most brilliant minds were treating this like the most complex mathematical problem ever created. They were applying advanced theories and formulas that Jake could not even pronounce. But what if they were all making it much harder than it actually was? To test his theory, Jake looked at the top left corner of his grid. There was a small 3 by 3 box that already had the numbers 1, 4, and 7 filled in. According to Sudoku rules, this box needed to also contain 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9. Jake looked at the empty squares in that box and tried to figure out which numbers could go where. One of the empty squares was in a row that already had a 2 in it somewhere else. So that square could not be a 2. The same square was in a column that already had a 5 in it, so it could not be a 5 either. Jake worked through the possibilities and realized that only the number 9 could go in that particular square. He used his writing device to carefully put a 9 in that space. The holographic display accepted his answer, and the number glowed softly, which seemed to mean it was correct. Jake felt a rush of excitement. He was right. This was Sudoku. The most feared examination in the galaxy was actually a simple puzzle that millions of humans solve for fun every day, while Jake was making this discovery. The academic disaster around him was getting worse. The Cerebroid collective near the middle of the room was now smoking so badly that small flames were starting to appear around their heads. Professor Zixthara had to send medical drones to spray them with some kind of cooling mist. A group of quantum beings had flickered so rapidly that they had accidentally opened small tears in space-time around their desks. Reality was bending in little waves around them, making it hard for other students to concentrate. Professor Zixthara looked very annoyed as she had to call for a team of maintenance drones to repair the fabric of space-time in the examination hall. Jake watched as Marcus Thompson, the other human student, suddenly stood up and started walking toward the exit. Jake wanted to call out to him to tell him that he was giving up too soon, but the examination rules forbid any communication between students. Jake could only watch helplessly as Marcus left the room, another victim of what everyone believed was an impossible test. The Mantoid scholars were having complete nervous breakdowns. Their clicking and chattering had become so loud that it was echoing off the walls. Several of them had actually damaged their mandibles from clicking too hard and fast. Green alien blood was dripping onto their desks as they continued to struggle with problems they thought required advanced mathematical theories. Near the back of the room, Jake could see Lucy Chun frantically erasing and rewriting formulas on her papers. She had covered 3 different sheets with complex equations, trying to find some way to approach the problem. Her hair was sticking up in all directions from running her hands through it, and Jake could see that she was close to tears. The draconian students were making sounds that Jake had never heard any creature make before. It was like a combination of roaring, crying, and mechanical grinding all at once. One of them had actually scratched deep grooves into its desk with its claws, and small pieces of metal were scattered around its feet, but Jake was no longer paying attention to the chaos around him. He was focused on his grid, working through it step by step using the simple rules his grandmother had taught him years ago. Where a row was missing only one number, he filled it in. Where a column needed only one more number to be complete, he added it. Where a 3x3 box was almost full, he completed it. The process was actually relaxing compared to what he had expected. There was no complex math involved, no advanced formulas or theories. It was just logic and patience. Look at what numbers are already there, figure out what numbers are missing, and determine where those missing numbers can go. Jake found a row that had 8 numbers already filled in, with only one empty square. The missing number had to be 6, because that was the only number from 1 to 9 that was not already in that row. He filled in the 6 and moved on to the next obvious choice. As he worked, Jake began to understand why this test had such a terrible reputation. The aliens taking it were approaching it with incredibly sophisticated thinking. They were trying to use quantum mathematics, interdimensional theory, and advanced probability calculations to solve what was essentially a children's puzzle. The Voltarian students, with their superior intellects, were probably considering thousands of different mathematical possibilities for each empty square. They were thinking so hard and so complexly that they were missing the simple, obvious solutions right in front of them. The geologian students were trying to apply their knowledge of planetary mathematics and geological calculations to fill in the grid. They were treating each number like it represented some kind of cosmic constant or universal force, when really it was just a number from 1 to 9. Jake looked at his progress and realized he was already about halfway done with the puzzle. Many of the squares that had seemed impossible when he first looked at them were now easy to fill in, because he had completed other parts of the grid that gave him the information he needed. He glanced at the time display floating near the ceiling. Only 45 minutes had passed since the examination began, and Jake was confident he could finish the entire puzzle within the next 20 or 30 minutes. Meanwhile, around him, students were still leaving in defeat, and others were working themselves into mental exhaustion trying to solve the first few squares. Jake almost felt guilty. Here he was, probably the least mathematically gifted student in the entire examination hall, and he was going to finish this test while brilliant minds from across the galaxy failed. It did not seem fair somehow, but then again, maybe that was the point. Maybe intelligence was not always about knowing the most complex theories or being able to do the hardest calculations. Maybe sometimes the smartest thing to do was to step back, look at a problem simply, and not overthink it. Jake smiled to himself and continued working on his Sudoku puzzle, wondering if his grandmother back on Earth had any idea that her morning hobby was considered the most challenging academic assessment in the known galaxy. Jake continued working through his puzzle with steady confidence. He used the techniques his grandmother had shown him during those Sunday mornings in her kitchen. When he found a square that could only contain one possible number, he filled it in. When a row or a column was missing just one number, he completed it. When he got stuck on one section, he moved to another part of the grid and came back later. The examination hall around him had become quieter, but not because students were concentrating better. It was because so many of them had already given up and left. What had started as hundreds of hopeful candidates was now down to maybe 50 students, still trying to solve the test. The remaining students were in various states of mental breakdown. The few Voltarian students who had not left yet were now flashing colors that Jake had never seen before. Their skin was cycling through deep purples, bright reds, and sickly yellows so fast that it was making other students dizzy to look at them. One Voltarian was rocking back and forth in its chair, making a high-pitched humming sound that echoed throughout the room. The Cerebroid Collective had managed to put out the small fires around their heads, but they were still smoking heavily. Their usually shiny silver skin was now completely dull and gray, like old metal that had been left out in the rain for years. Jake could see that they were still trying to work together to solve the puzzle, but their collective intelligence seemed to be working against them, making the problem more complex instead of simpler. Near the front of the room, one of the last remaining Mantoid scholars was having what could only be described as a complete nervous breakdown. It had clicked its mandibles so hard and so fast that one of them had actually broken off and was lying on the floor next to its desk. Green blood was pooling around the creature's feet, but it was so focused on trying to solve the exam that it did not seem to notice its injury. The draconian students who were still in the room had gone completely silent, which was somehow more disturbing than when they had been making those terrible growling sounds. They were staring at their holographic displays with a look of total defeat, their usually proud postures slumped and broken. Jake felt sorry for all of them, but he could not help feeling amazed at how they were approaching the problem. He watched a quantum being trying to solve a single square by considering every possible mathematical relationship between the numbers in 17 different dimensions. The creature was flickering in and out of reality so rapidly that it was creating small lightning bolts in the air around its desk. Meanwhile, Jake looked at the same type of square and simply thought about which numbers were already used in that row, column, and 3-3 box. The answer was obvious when you approached it that way. The number 7 was the only one that could fit in that space. As Jake worked through more of the puzzle, he started to see patterns that made the remaining squares even easier to fill in. This was another trick his grandmother had taught him. Once you got enough numbers filled in, the rest of the puzzle started to solve itself. Empty squares that had seemed impossible at the beginning were now obvious because there was only one number that could possibly go in each space. He was now about 3/4 of the way finished with the entire puzzle. Looking around the room, Jake realized that he might be one of only a few students who were making any real progress at all. Most of the remaining candidates were still struggling with the first few squares they had attempted over an hour ago. The sight that made Jake feel the worst was watching Lucy Chun. She was still in the room, but barely. Her hair was a complete mess, and she had torn several holes in her papers from erasing so hard. She had covered 5 different sheets with complex mathematical formulas, trying to find some advanced theoretical approach to solving the puzzle. Jake could see from across the room that she was crying silently as she worked. Lucy was a much better student than Jake in almost every subject. She had always been the smart one in their group back on Earth, but right now, her intelligence was working against her. She was thinking too hard, trying to apply advanced calculus and quantum theory to what was essentially a simple logic puzzle. Jake wished he could help her, but the examination rules were very strict about not communicating with other students. All he could do was watch as one of his friends struggled with a problem that he now knew how to solve easily, the rock-like. Geologian student sitting next to Jake had stopped making grinding sounds and was now completely still. Jake was not sure if it had given up or if it was thinking so hard that it had entered some kind of hibernation state. Small pieces of crystal were still occasionally breaking off from its body and falling to the floor with tiny tinkling sounds. On his other side, the giant insect creature had finally stopped clicking its mandibles. Instead, it was now making a low buzzing sound, like a broken air conditioner. Its bright green eyes had gone dull, and Jake thought it might actually be having some kind of medical emergency from the stress. Professor Zixthara was walking around the room, her multiple crystal faces showing what Jake thought was concern for her students. She stopped at several desks to check on students who seemed to be in distress. At one point, she had to call medical drones to carry out a crystalloid student, who had actually shattered from the mental pressure. The time display near the ceiling showed that 2 hours had passed since the examination began. Jake looked at his puzzle and realized he only had about 10 squares left to fill in. At the rate he was going, he would be finished within the next 15 minutes. He felt a strange mix of excitement and guilt. Excitement because he was actually going to pass the most difficult examination in the galaxy. Guilt because he was succeeding while so many brilliant minds around him were failing. Jake worked through the remaining squares methodically. A 3 went in this corner because it was the only number missing from that row. A 5 went in that space because the column already had all the other numbers. An 8 completed a 3-3 box that was missing only one number. As he filled in each square, Jake double-checked his work the way his grandmother had taught him. Make sure each row has all 9 numbers. Make sure each column has all 9 numbers. Make sure each 3-3 box has all 9 numbers. No repeats anywhere. The puzzle was almost complete now. Jake had only 3 empty squares left, and he could see exactly which numbers needed to go in each one. A 2 in the bottom left corner, a 6 in the middle right, and finally a 4 in the very center of the grid. Jake carefully filled in the last 3 numbers and then spent several minutes checking his entire solution. He went through each row, each column, and each 3-3 box to make sure everything was correct. Every section contained the numbers 1 through 9 exactly once, with no repeats and no missing numbers. He had done it. He had solved the universal mathematical reasoning assessment, the test that was supposed to be impossible, that had broken the spirits of countless brilliant minds across the galaxy, was complete. Jake looked around the examination hall and realized that there were now only about 20 students left in the entire massive room. The rest had given up and left in defeat. Of those who remained, most looked like they were close to complete mental exhaustion, with 2.5 hours still remaining on the examination clock. Jake quietly raised his hand to signal that he was finished. He sat back in his chair and waited for Professor Zixthara to notice him, wondering what would happen next. Professor Zixthara noticed Jake's raised hand and walked over to his desk. Her multiple crystal faces turned to look at his holographic display, and Jake watched as all of her geometric features went completely still. For a moment, he worried that maybe he had done something wrong. "You believe you have completed the assessment?" Professor Zixthara asked, her harmonic voice sounding different than before. There was something in her tone that Jake could not identify. "Yes, Professor," Jake said quietly, trying not to disturb the other students who were still working. "I think I have solved it." Professor Zixthara studied his grid carefully. Her crystal body began to glow brighter as she examined each row, each column, and each smaller section within the larger puzzle. Jake held his breath as she checked his work. "This is most unusual," she said finally. "Your solution appears to be correct, but your methodology is completely different from anything I have seen before." She gestured with one of her arms, and Jake's completed puzzle was suddenly displayed on a large holographic screen at the front of the room. The few remaining students looked up from their own struggles to see what was happening. Jake heard gasps and strange alien sounds of surprise coming from around the room. The Cerebroid Collective stopped smoking and stared at the screen with their dull gray eyes. The remaining Voltarian students flashed bright white, which Jake had learned meant they were shocked. "Please explain to the class how you solved this." "Assessment," Professor Zixtara said, her voice now carrying clearly throughout the entire hall. Jake felt his face turn red as hundreds of alien eyes turned to look at him. He had never been comfortable speaking in front of groups, and this was by far the largest and strangest audience he had ever faced. "Well," Jake began, his voice cracking slightly, "I just treated it like a Sudoku puzzle." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the humming of the building's air system. Professor Zixthara's crystal faces rotated to look at him from different angles. "What puzzle?" she asked. "Sudoku," Jake repeated, feeling more nervous by the second. "It's a number puzzle from Earth. You have to put the numbers 1 through 9. In each row, each column, and each 3-3 box, but you can only use each number once in each section." Jake watched as Professor Zixthara's crystal body began to pulse with different colors. She was accessing the university's database, searching for information about what Jake had just described. "This Sudoku," she said slowly, "is it considered a complex mathematical exercise on your world?" Jake almost laughed, but caught himself just in time. "No, Professor. It's more like a hobby. People do them for fun. My grandmother used to solve them every morning while she drank her coffee. They print them in newspapers next to the comics and crossword puzzles." The reaction in the room was immediate and dramatic. The remaining Cerebroid Collective actually fell off their chairs in shock. The Voltarian students began flashing so many different colors at once that they looked like broken Christmas lights. One of the quantum beings flickered so violently that it accidentally opened a small portal to another dimension before quickly closing it again. Professor Zixthara stood perfectly still for nearly a full minute, processing this information. When she finally spoke, her voice had a strange quality that Jake had never heard before. "You are telling me," she said carefully, "that the Universal Mathematical Reasoning Assessment, which has challenged the greatest minds in galactic history for over 3,000 years, is equivalent to a recreational puzzle that elderly humans solve for entertainment?" "Yes, ma'am," Jake said quietly. "I think so." Professor Zixthara turned to address the remaining students in the room. "The examination is now concluded," she announced. "All remaining students may leave. Results will be posted within 1 galactic standard hour." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then chaos erupted. The few remaining students began talking all at once in dozens of different languages. Some were angry, some were confused, and others seemed to be having some kind of mental breakdown from the revelation. Lucy Chun appeared at Jake's desk, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Jake, what just happened? Did you really solve the entire exam by treating it like a Sudoku puzzle?" "I think so," Jake said, still not quite believing it himself. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you. The rules said we couldn't communicate during the exam." Lucy stared at him for a moment, then started laughing. It was not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes when something is so absurd that you do not know how else to react. "I spent 3 months studying advanced mathematical theory," she said, still laughing. "I read every book I could find about quantum mathematics and interdimensional calculations. And the answer was a puzzle that kids do in activity books." Word of what had happened spread through the university faster than Jake thought possible. Within an hour, his dormitory room was surrounded by alien students, professors, and researchers who all wanted to meet the human who had solved the unsolvable. Jake's communication device was buzzing constantly with messages from news organizations across the galaxy. Everyone wanted to interview the student who had revealed that the most feared academic assessment in known space was actually a simple logic puzzle. The official results were posted exactly 1 hour after the exam ended, just as Professor Zixthara had promised. Jake Morrison had achieved a perfect score. He was the only student out of the original 847 test takers who had successfully completed the assessment, but the real shock came 3 days later, when Jake received a holographic message that made him nearly fall out of his chair. The message was addressed to Mrs. Dorothy Morrison of Riverside, California, Earth. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," the message began, and Jake recognized Professor Zixthara's harmonic voice. "I am Professor Zixthara of the Galactic University of Advanced Sciences. I am writing to offer you a position as Professor Emeritus in our Department of Advanced Logic and Reasoning." The message continued to explain that the university had learned about Dorothy Morrison's daily practice of solving universal mathematical reasoning matrices and wanted to offer her a full research position studying what they now called Morrison logic methods. Jake called his grandmother immediately, using the university's interdimensional communication system. When her face appeared on the holographic display, she looked confused but pleased to see him. "Hi, Grandma," Jake said, grinning. "How would you feel about becoming a professor at an alien university?" "What are you talking about, sweetie?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. Jake explained everything that had happened, from the terrifying exam to his realization about Sudoku to the job offer. His grandmother listened patiently, occasionally asking him to repeat parts that seemed too strange to believe. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then his grandmother started chuckling, the same warm laugh he remembered from his childhood. "Well," she said finally, "I always knew those puzzles were good exercise for the brain. I just never thought they would get me a job offer from outer space." Within a month, Jake's grandmother had accepted the position and was living in a specially designed habitat on Zarian Prime. She became the most popular professor in the university's history, teaching Introduction to Morrison Logic to packed lecture halls filled with amazed alien students. The universal mathematical reasoning assessment was quietly retired and replaced with new examinations that actually required advanced mathematical knowledge. Jake became something of a celebrity throughout the galaxy, known as the human who had accidentally revolutionized galactic education by recognizing a simple pattern that thousands of brilliant minds had missed. And every morning, Jake would visit his grandmother in her new office, where she would be sitting with a cup of Earth coffee, solving the puzzle that had once been the most feared exam in the galaxy, just like she had done every day for the past 40 years.